Orléans is the name used by several branches of the royal House of France, all descended in the legitimate male line from the dynasty's founder, Hugh Capet. It became a tradition during France's ancient regime for the Duchy of Orléans to be granted as an appanage to a younger son of the king. While each of the Orléans branches thus descended from a junior prince, they were always among the king's nearest relations in the male line, sometimes aspiring and sometimes succeeding to the throne itself. The last cadet branch to hold the ducal title descended from the younger son of Louis XIII of France, and is sometimes known as the House of Bourbon-Orléans. From 1709 until the French Revolution, the Orléans dukes were next in the order of succession to the French throne after members of the senior branch of the House of Bourbon descended from Louis XIV. Louis XIII's younger brother and youngest son were granted the dukedom successively in 1626 and 1660. And since they had contemporaneous living descendants, there were actually two Bourbon-Orléans branches at court during the reign of Louis XIV. The elder of these branches consisted of Gaston, Duc d'Orléans, younger son of Henry IV, and the four daughters of his two marriages. The junior and final House of Orléans descended from Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, Louis XIV's younger brother. Although Louis XIV's direct descendants retained the throne, his brother Philip's descendants flourished until the end of the French monarchy, held the crown from 1830 to 1848, and still exist as pretenders. The dukes. Upon the death of Gaston and of Orléans, the appanage of the Duchy of Orléans reverted to the crown. The appanage was given to Philippe, the brother of Louis XIV of France. It was Philippe and his second wife, the famous court writer Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, who founded the modern House of Orléans, their surviving son being the regent of France for the young Louis XV. As a fils de France, Philip's surname was de France. Upon his death, his son inherited the Orléans dukedom, but as only a petit fils de France, his surname was taken from his father's main title, and was thus d'Orléans. The first two dukes, as son and patrilineal grandson, respectively, of a French king, were entitled to be addressed as Royal Highness. But Philippe I was primarily known as Monsieur, the style reserved for the king's eldest brother at the French court. Philippe II was succeeded as duke by his son Louis d'Orléans, who was entitled to the style of Serene Highness as a Prince du Sang. After 1709, the heads of the Orléans branch of the House of Bourbon ranked as the premier princes du Sang. This meant that the dukes could be addressed as Monsieur le Prince, and that, should there be no heir to the crown of France in the king's immediate family, then the Orléans family would ascend the throne by right. Other dukes members of the House of Orléans: François Gaston Michel Marie of Orléans, Duke of Orléans, second son of Henry, Comte de Paris; Jacques-Jean Yaroslav Marie of Orléans, Duke of Orléans, fourth son of Henry, Comte de Paris. History. Under Louis XIV, Gaston de France became the Duke of Orléans in 1626, and held that title until his death in 1660. His nephew, Louis XIV, then gave Gaston's appanages to his younger brother, who thus became Philippe I, Duke of Orléans. At court, Gaston was known as Le Grand Monsieur, and Philippe was called Le Petit Monsieur while both princes were alive. Before then, Philippe had been known as the Duc d'Anjou. Besides receiving the appanage of Orléans, he also received the duchies of Valois and Chartres. Duc de Chartres became the courtesy title by which the heirs apparent of the Dukes of Orléans were known during their fathers' lifetimes. Until the birth of the king's son, the Dauphin Louis, the Duke of Orléans was the heir presumptive to the crown. He was to maintain a high position at court till his death in 1701. Prince du Sang in 1709, the fifth Prince de Condé died. He was the premier Prince du Sang and head of the House of Bourbon-Condé. As a result of this death, the title of Premier Prince passed to the House of Orléans, as they were closer in blood to the throne of France. But since the two senior males of that line held higher rank as, respectively, Fils de France and Petit Fils de France, they did not make use of the title and had no need of its attached prerogative, a household and retinue maintained at the expense of the crown. The Orléans household was already large, as it held the staff of Philippe II d'Orléans and of his wife, as well as the staff of his widowed mother, the Dowager Duchess. This combined household, though not fully functional until 1723, contained almost 250 members including officers, courtiers, footmen, gardeners, and even barbers. The Regency. On the death of Louis XIV in September 1715, the new king, Louis XV, was but 5 years old. The country was then governed by the new king's older relative Philippe II d'Orléans as the regent of France. This period in French history is known as the Regency, and gave the House of Orléans the preeminent position and political role in France during the king's minority. The regent ruled France from his family residence in Paris, the Palais Royal. He installed the young Louis XV in the Palais du Louvre, which was opposite the Palais Royal. In January 1723, Louis XV gained his majority and began to govern the country on his own. The young king moved the court back to Versailles, and in December, Philippe II died and his son, Louis d'Orléans, succeeded him as third duke and, more importantly, as France's heir presumptive. Nonetheless, since his rank by birth was Prince du Sang, that of Premier Prince du Sang constituted a higher style, of which he and his descendants henceforth made use. Under Louis XV, Louis d'Orléans was in several ways his father's opposite, being retiring by nature and extremely devout. Although still in his 20s when widowed, he did not remarry after his wife's death, and is not known to have ever taken a mistress. He died in the monastery of Saint Genevieve in Paris. His son, Louis Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, was the fourth of his line to hold that title. After having a distinguished military career, he decided to live quietly with his mistress, the Marquise de Montesson, at the Château de Saint-Assis. Louis XVI, Louis Philippe I d'Orléans and his wife, Louise Henriette de Bourbon, had 2 children. The fifth Duke, Louis Philippe II d'Orléans, known to history as Philippe Égalité, and Bathilde d'Orléans as the Duc de Chartres, Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, married one of his cousins, Louise Marie Adélaïde de Bourbon. She was the sole heiress of the House of Bourbon-Penthièvre, which had accumulated vast wealth bestowed, despite their bar sinister, on the princes legitimus by their father, Louis XIV. The Duchess de Chartres had a dowry of 6 million livres, the modern equivalent of almost £20 million. And an annual allowance of over 500,000 livres, the modern equivalent of almost £1.7 million per year. Upon the death of her father, she inherited the remainder of the Bourbon-Penthièvre revenues and chateau. Louis Philippe II was given the surname Égalité when French titles of nobility were abolished in 1790. His wife outlived him by almost 30 years. Louise Marie Thérèse Bathilde d'Orléans married Louis Henry II, Prince of Condé, the last of his house, and was the mother of the Duc d'Enghien, who was executed by Napoleon. She died in 1822, the same year as her sister-in-law the Duchesse d'Orléans. They were both buried in the Chapelle Royale de Dreux. Revolution. At the time of the French Revolution, Philippe Égalité was the only person of royal blood to actively support the revolution. He went so far as to vote for the execution of his cousin, King Louis XVI, an act which earned him popularity among the revolutionaries, and the undying hostility of many French monarchists. He remained in prison until October, the beginning of the Reign of Terror. He was shortlisted for a trial on October 3, and effectively tried and guillotined in the space of 1 day, on the orders of Maximilien Robespierre. Most of the Orléans family were forced to flee. The new Duc d'Orléans had fled to Austria several months previously, triggering the arrest of his father. His brother, the Duc de Montpensier, would die in England, and his sister fled to Switzerland after being imprisoned for a while. The youngest brother, Louis Charles, Count of Beaujolais, was thrown into a prison in the south of France in 1793, but later escaped to the United States. He too died in exile. Of the Orléans, only the widow of Philippe Égalité was able to remain in France unhindered until, in 1797 she, too, was banished to Spain along with the few remaining Bourbons who still lived in France. In 1814, during the Bourbon Restoration, the three remaining members of the family, the Duc d'Orléans, his mother and sister, returned to Paris. The family's properties and titles were returned to them by Louis XVIII. Louis XIV and his younger brother Le Petit Monsieur, Philippe II d'Orléans with his protégé, Louis XV. Louis XVI's execution. His cousin, Philippe Égalité, voted for his infamous execution. The arms of the King of the French July monarchy. In 1830, following the French July Revolution, the House of Orléans became the ruling house when the monarch of the elder restored Bourbon line, Charles X, was replaced by the sixth Duke, Louis Philippe III d'Orléans, son of Philippe Égalité. Louis Philippe ruled as a constitutional monarch, and as such was called King of the French, rather than of France. His reign lasted until the Revolution of 1848, when he abdicated and fled to England. Even after his ouster, an Orléanist faction remained active, supporting a return of the House of Orléans to power. Legitimist monarchists, however, continued to uphold the rights of the elder line of Bourbons, who came close to regaining the throne after the fall of the Second Empire. In the early 1870s, a majority of deputies in the National Assembly were monarchists, as was the nation's president, MacMahon. Thus, it was widely expected that the old dynasty would be invited to remount the throne, in the person of either the Bourbon or the Orléans claimant. To seize this opportunity, the Orléanists offered a so-called fusion, whereby King Louis Philippe's grandson and heir, Philippe, Comte de Paris, accepted the childless legitimist pretender's right to the throne, thereby potentially uniting French royalists in support of a single candidate. But the refusal of the last male of Louis XIV's direct line, the Comte de Chambord, to accept the tricolore as France's flag under a restored monarchy proved an insurmountable obstacle to his candidacy. Although the Orléans had reigned under the tricolour without objection, this time the Orléans princes did not abandon the cause of the head of their dynasty by seeking to offer themselves as alternative candidates. By the time Chambord died and the Orléans felt free to reassert their claim to the throne, the political moment had passed, and France had become resolutely republican. France has had neither a Bourbon nor Orléans monarch since 1848. Louis Philippe and his family lived in England until his death in Clermont, Surrey. Like his mother, he and his wife, Amelia, were buried at the Chapelle Royale de Dreux. In 1883, the Comte de Chambord died without children. As a result, some legitimists recognized the House of Orléans as the heirs to the throne of France. However, a portion of the legitimists, still resentful of the revolutionary credentials of the House of Orléans, transferred their loyalties to the Carlist heirs of the Spanish Bourbons, who represented the most senior branch of the Capetians, even though they had renounced their claim to the French throne to obtain Spain in 1713. Thus to their supporters, not only are the heads of the House of Orléans the rightful heirs to the constitutionalist title of King of the French, but also to the legitimist title of King of France and Navarre. Contemporary family. The head of the house today is Henry, Comte de Paris, Duc de France. He is a claimant to the French throne. If he were king, he would be Henry VII. For the Orléanists, he is the heir of King Louis Philippe of the French. For legitimists, the heir of Henry, Comte de Chambord, and so of Charles X of France. present family on 5 July 1957, he married Duchess Marie Thérèse of Wurtemberg, a descendant of King Louis Philippe. He received the title Comte de Clermont. 5 children were born from this union, before the marriage ended in divorce. Princess Marie-Isabelle Marguerite Anne Genevieve of Orléans married civilly at Dreux on the 22nd of July 1989 and religiously in Friedrichshafen on the 22nd of July 1989 to Prince Gundekar of Liechtenstein, and has issue. Prince François-Henri Louis Marie of Orléans, Comte de Clermont, severely disabled. Princess Blanche Elizabeth Rose Marie of Orléans, severely disabled. Prince Jean-Charles Pierre-Marie of Orléans, Duke of Vendôme and Dauphin de Vienna, married civilly in Paris on 19 March 2009 and religiously at the Cathédrale Notre-Dame at Senlis on 2 May 2009 to Philomena de Tournos-Steinhardt, with whom he has 3 children. Prince Gaston Louis Antoine Marie of Orléans, Princess Antoinette Léopoldine Jean Marie of Orléans, Princess Louise Marguerite Eleanor Marie of Orléans, Prince Eudes Thibault Joseph Marie of Orléans, Duke of Angoulême, married civilly at Dreux on 19 June 1999 and religiously in Antrain on 10 July 1999 to Marie-Lise Claude Anne Rolande de Rohan Chabot, with whom he has 2 children. Princess Thérèse Isabelle Marie-Éléonore, Prince Pierre Jean-Marie d'Orléans. Appanages. Throughout the years of the Ancien Regime, the Orléans household received vast riches in terms of wealth and property. Philippe de France obtained for the House of Bourbon Orléans, during the rule of his brother Louis XIV, the following: the ducal titles of Orléans, Valois, Chartres and the Lordship of Montargis. This occurred in 1660, shortly after the death of Gaston, Duke of Orléans, who had no male descendants. The family might also have obtained the county of Blois and with it the Château de Blois, Château de Chambord and also the governorship of Languedoc, but Philippe de France was refused these by his brother. In 1672 Louis XIV added the Duchy of Nemours, the countships of Dordogne and Romorantin, and the marquessates of Coucy and Folembray. In 1692, Philippe's son and heir, Philippe II, married Françoise Marie de Bourbon, a legitimated daughter of Louis XIV by his liaison with Madame de Montespan. In order to convince his brother to allow his son to marry one of his illegitimate daughters, the king gave him the Palais Royal and promised him a dowry of 2 million livres. This palace became the Paris residence of the Dukes of Orléans until 1792. The Orléans Canal, built by Philippe de France, was used by the family to transport their timber from the Orléans forest to the capital where it was sold. The canal was nationalized during the Revolution. Under the regent, Philippe II d'Orléans, he quietly increased his wife's annual allowance to 400,000 livres while he was in power. He also bought many buildings around Paris, although many were sold by his grandson. It was also he who bought the Regent Diamond, which was kept at the Louvre in Paris, under Louis d'Orléans. In 1740, Louis XV added the Hôtel de Grand Ferrari at Fontainebleau. The king added the Countship of Soissons in 1751 and the lordships of Laon, Ciarie-Acute-Py and Noyon. By 1734, the family's income exceeded 1 million livres annually in rents due from the ducal domains of Orléans, Valois, Chartres, and the lordship of Montargis. Sales of timber from such vast tracts as the Orléans forest added 500,000 livres. Under Louis Philippe d'Orléans, rents came in from the towns of La Fère, Marle, Ham, Saint-Gobain, the Hôtel du Plessis-Châtillon and from the Ourcq Canal. Because the Dukes of Orléans were also the premier princes du sang, the kingdom's treasury paid for their personal household of 265 staff and officers. Along with towns and buildings, the family derived income from its forests on the ducal lands at Orléans, Beaugency, Montargis, Romorantin, Dordogne, Brouardan, Villers-Cotterêts, Lane, Coucy, Lafayette, Marle, and Saint-Gobain. The original appanage was returned to the Orléans family in May 1814 by Louis XVIII. It was united with the domain of the crown upon Louis-Philippe d'Orléans' accession to the throne in 1830, at which time it was worth about 2.5 million francs in annual income.